You know those images, right? People marching, fighting just for the right to vote. It feels so powerful, so historic.
It really does. A cornerstone of American democracy.
But then you look around today, and for a lot of people, maybe that same energy isn't quite there. It feels like there's a disconnect sometimes between that history and how things actually work now.
That's a really common feeling, I think. We get bombarded with news, politics, government decisions, local, state, federal. Well, it can be overwhelming.
Totally. So that's what we wanted to tackle in this deep dive. We've sifted through quite a bit of material, some foundational stuff on American government, but also deeper analysis on who actually participates, who holds power, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the goal isn't just to rehash high school civics.
Right. We want to cut through some of that noise, give you a clearer picture of what government is, fundamentally, who seems to have the influence, and maybe most importantly, how you, listening right now, can actually plug in, engage in ways that feel meaningful without getting totally lost.
Exactly. We're trying to pull out those key insights, the things that might make you go, ah, okay, I see that differently now, help you understand the system and maybe where you fit in.
Okay, let's dive in. First things first. What is government? Seems basic, maybe, but let's nail it down.
Well, at its heart, government is just the means by which a society organizes itself. It's how we collectively allocate authority to achieve shared goals.
Shared goals like safety, economic prosperity.
Precisely. Things like that. And politics, that's sort of the process within that structure. It's about gaining and exercising control, especially when it comes to deciding how resources get divided up.
So the arguments over budgets, education funding versus military spending, for example, that's politics.
That's politics in action, exactly. Different groups competing for those resources, trying to achieve their specific goals through the government.
Got it. So it's the system and then the process within the system. The sources also made a point of separating governmental systems from economic systems. Why is that important to understand?
It's crucial because they've often developed hand in hand, historically speaking. Think about capitalism. It really emerged alongside ideas of democratic republics, self-government.
Like John Locke, with natural rights, life, liberty, property.
Exactly. Locke's ideas about rights and government by consent really fit well with an economic system where individuals own and control property. Freedom in both spheres, kind of.
And then Adam Smith enters the picture with The Wealth of Nations.
Right. He argued for free markets, let competition do its thing with minimal government meddling.
So in the U.S., this link between representative democracy and capitalism became really strong. People often see them as two sides of the same coin: freedom, individualism.
They do, but, and this is a key point the sources raise, there's a tension there. Capitalism, while creating opportunity, can also lead to pretty significant wealth inequality.
And that inequality can bleed over into politics.
It absolutely can. If a small group has vastly more wealth, they might also gain disproportionate political influence funding campaigns, lobbying, shaping the debate. That potentially undermines the democratic ideal of, one person, one vote. Everyone's vote counts the same, but does everyone's voice? Maybe not equally.
That makes sense. Which leads us to other systems, like socialism. We hear that word thrown around a lot. How does it differ fundamentally?
Well, socialism as an economic system generally means the government owns and controls the main means of producing wealth. Major industries, banks, things like that.
Instead of private individuals or companies.
Exactly. And the idea often is that the government then redistributes that wealth through social programs like universal health care or free education.
And the sources mentioned it's sometimes linked with oligarchy.
Yes, they noted that historically some socialist systems have existed alongside oligarchies, where political power is held by a small elite, maybe a single political party. China is often used as an example of that kind of structure.
Okay, so different economic paths, different political structures. Now, you mentioned government providing things. The sources broke down different types of goods. That was actually really clarifying for me.
It's a useful framework. You've got private goods, things you buy in the market for yourself. Your groceries, your clothes, your house.
Stuff the market provides pretty easily.
Right. Then you have public goods. These are things the government usually provides, available to everyone, typically without a direct charge at the point of use. Think national security or public libraries, maybe basic K-12 education in many places.
Why can't the market provide those?
Well, it's hard to charge people individually for, say, national defense, and you can't really exclude someone from benefiting even if they don't pay. So the private market doesn't have a great incentive to provide them efficiently for everyone.
Okay. And then there were these middle categories, toll goods and common goods.
Yeah, toll goods are things that are available to many, but you usually have to pay a fee to access them, like a private school or a toll road. You pay the toll, you get to use it.
Makes sense. And common goods.
Common goods are things that are free for anyone to use, but there's a limited supply. The classic example is fish in the ocean or clean water from a river. Anyone can take them, but if everyone takes too much.
They run out. The tragedy of the commons.
Exactly. And that's where government often steps in with regulations, fishing limits, pollution controls to try and manage these resources sustainably, keep them from being depleted. There's often conflict there, right, between, say, environmental groups and commercial fishers trying to find that balance.
So government isn't just like handing out stuff. It's creating the whole structure. The laws, the taxes, the agencies.
Precisely. It builds the framework. Local, state, national governments, they all set up systems with elected officials, legislatures making laws, and they fund it all through taxes, income tax, property tax, sales tax. Then they create budgets deciding where that money goes. Parks, roads, schools, defense.
And it's also about setting rules for the market itself, right? Not just providing goods.
Absolutely. Maintaining order, yes, but also regulating the marketplace. Think banking regulations, rules about pollution, food safety standards, making sure kids' toys aren't dangerous. It's a far cry from Adam Smith's completely hands-off idea.
So it's providing things, structuring things, and regulating things. And crucially, especially in democracies, there are ways for citizens to have a say.
Yes, that's fundamental. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to vote. These are avenues for participation. And ultimately, politics boils down to choices about values.
What do you mean?
Well, does the government prioritize individual liberty above all else, or does it lean more towards ensuring equality? How much security are we willing to trade for privacy? These are political choices. And how much people engage, how much they participate, influences which values get prioritized.
That brings us to the types of government. We usually say the U.S. is a republic or a representative democracy. What does that actually mean day to day?
It means we don't vote on every single law ourselves. Instead, we elect people, members of Congress, the president, state legislators, city council members to represent us and make those decisions.
So they act on our behalf.
Right. And generally, decisions are made by majority rule. But, and this is critical in a republic like ours, the rights of minorities are protected. Just because 51% want something doesn't mean they can trample the fundamental rights of the other 49%. The sources use the example of protecting the rights of atheists even if they are a small minority.
Okay. And that's different from a direct democracy.
Very different. Think ancient Athens, where eligible citizens literally gathered and voted on laws directly. We have tiny bits of that in the U.S., like local town meetings in New England or state-level referendums where people vote directly on a specific proposal, but it's not our main system.
And then there are less democratic forms.
Right. Monarchies, where rule is inherited. Oligarchies, where a small group of elites holds power, maybe wealthy families, military leaders, or a political party. And then totalitarianism, where the government tries to control basically every aspect of life. North Korea is often cited there. These just show the vast range of how power can be structured.
Okay, so we've got a handle on what government is, its functions, different types. Now, the really big question, who actually runs this show in the U.S.? Is it the people? Or someone else? The sources laid out two main theories here, elite theory and pluralism.
Yeah, this is a central debate. Does power rest with the many or the few? Elite theory basically argues that despite the democratic structures, a relatively small interconnected group of powerful individuals from corporations, the military, politics really calls the shots.
Like C. Wright Mills' the power elite idea.
Exactly that. Often highly educated, often from prestigious universities, moving between positions in business and government. The theory suggests they use their influence to maintain their advantages, and that politicians are often more responsive to them than to average citizens.
What's the evidence for that view? The sources mention things like the educational background of presidents in Congress.
Right. The high percentage of Ivy League graduates among presidents, the number of members of Congress who were in business or law before getting elected, and also the demographics. Historically, Congress has been predominantly white and male, which raises questions about whose perspectives are really represented at the highest levels.
And how does that background potentially affect policy?
Well, the argument is that someone's background shapes their worldview and priorities. For example, would someone who has only ever used private schools prioritize funding for public education in the same way as someone reliant on it? Or would a flat tax, which often benefits higher earners more, seem fairer to someone in a high-income bracket?
The sources mentioned a high number of millionaires in Congress.
Yes, and that their children often attend private schools. These aren't definitive proofs of elite control, but they are data points that proponents of elite theory point to, suggesting a potential disconnect between the experiences of lawmakers and many of their constituents.
Okay, so that's the elite theory perspective. But then there's pluralism. How does that differ?
Pluralism offers well, a more optimistic view, perhaps. It suggests that political power isn't locked up by one elite group. Instead, it's distributed among many different competing interest groups.
Like environmental groups, unions, business associations.
Exactly. People with shared interests organize. They lobby, they advocate, they try to influence policy on issues they care about. And because there are so many levels of government, local, state, federal, there are lots of different places or access points where these groups can try to make their voices heard.
So power is more spread out, more dynamic.
That's the idea. Robert Dahl, a key pluralist thinker, argued that politicians want to get elected and reelected, so they tend to listen to groups and citizens who are politically active and can deliver votes or support. It's a competition of interests playing out in the political arena.
So two pretty different pictures of where power lies. But the sources also talked about trade-offs, which seems to kind of bridge the gap.
I think that's a good way to put it. The reality is often messy. Government action usually involves balancing competing interests and making compromises. It's rarely a clear win for just one group, whether elite or grassroots. It's an ongoing process of negotiation and trade-offs.
Can you give some examples of these trade-offs?
Sure. Think about the arguments during the pandemic over mask mandates that was a trade-off between federal guidance, state authority, and individual liberty concerns.
Oh, yeah.
Or the balance between national security and civil liberties. How much surveillance by agencies like the FBI or NSA is acceptable versus privacy rights championed by groups like the ACLU.
Right. Constant tension there.
Another one is freedom of speech versus protecting others' rights. The Supreme Court case about buffer zones around abortion clinics, McCullen v. Coakley, is a good example of that clash.
What about economic issues?
Definitely. Think about fracking. It offers potential economic benefits, jobs, energy independence, but raises environmental and health concerns. That's a major trade-off governments have to weigh. Sometimes these conflicts happen even within the same state, like coastal communities wanting tourism versus others wanting offshore drilling jobs.
And even for individual politicians, right?
Yeah.
Loyalty to their party versus what their constituents back home actually want.
Absolutely. Maybe the party wants to cut spending on something like benefits for the elderly, but the representative knows that would be deeply unpopular in their district. That's a tough trade-off. The ongoing national debate about gun control is another huge one, seeing federal gridlock while some states pass their own background check laws. It highlights these competing pressures and values constantly at play.
It really sounds like governing is just this constant juggling act.
Okay.
So we've talked about what government is, who might be pulling the levers.
Yeah.
Now, the final piece, engagement. Where do we fit in? How does individual action actually matter in this complex system?
It absolutely matters. That's a core message. Participation is how you can influence those trade-offs we just talked about, how you can push for the values and policies you care about. Even if you don't get everything you want, being engaged makes a difference.
The pluralist view really relies on that, doesn't it? Competing groups need active members.
It does. And even if you tend to believe more in the elite theory, voting is still crucial. It might not overthrow the whole system, but it can change who the elites are, which can shift priorities.
But there's this worry, right? Robert Putnam wrote about this decline in civic engagement, people being less involved in community groups, less social capital, bowling alone, as he put it.
Yeah, his work got a lot of attention. He pointed to things like more women working outside the home, changes in family structures, maybe technology isolating us as potential reasons for fewer people joining those traditional face-to-face groups.
Is that really happening, though? Or is an engagement just changing form?
That's the counter-argument. Maybe people aren't joining bowling leagues as much, but they might be joining soccer leagues or online communities or different kinds of advocacy groups. Putnam himself was a bit skeptical about whether online connections build the same kind of trust and cooperation as face-to-face interaction, but it's an ongoing debate. Engagement might just look different now.
Whatever the form, The benefits of engagement seem pretty clear from history.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the major strides made because ordinary people got involved and demanded change. The abolitionist movement fighting against slavery, the women's suffrage movement demanding the vote, the civil rights movement challenging segregation.
Using tactics like marches, boycott speeches, writing letters.
Exactly. Those actions, often taken at great personal risk, led to profound changes. Desegregation, anti-discrimination laws, expanded voting rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ rights gaining ground. And it's not just about massive national movements.
Right, like local stuff, too.
Yeah, local activism can really improve quality of life. People organizing to create a community garden, build a park, improve local schools. Engagement empowers people at all levels.
And fundamentally, for a representative democracy like ours to function well, it needs engaged citizens, doesn't it?
It's essential. You need people who are informed, who pay attention, who vote thoughtfully for candidates they believe will represent their interests, and who let those representatives know what they think. Otherwise, government actions might drift away from what the majority actually wants or needs, and it potentially makes it easier for well-organized, perhaps elite interests to dominate the process. Engagement keeps the system more accountable.
Okay, so if engagement is so important, how can people actually do it? What are the options?
The sources laid out a whole spectrum, really, from things that don't take a huge amount of time or effort to much more involved actions.
Like on the easier end.
Just staying informed is a big one. Reading reputable news sources, listening to informative programs, maybe following issues online. Though you always have to be critical about sources online, watch out for bias and, fake news.
Sure. What else?
Writing or emailing your elected officials. It might seem small, but they do track constituent communications. Filing a complaint if a service isn't working. Responding to opinion polls. Even participating in online discussions or blogs if done thoughtfully.
Okay, so accessible starting points. What about things that take a bit more effort?
Voting is key. It sounds obvious, but actually registering and showing up to vote makes a real difference, especially in close elections. Attending a rally or a town hall meeting, donating money to a campaign or a cause you believe in, signing or even starting a petition.
And then there's getting involved with groups.
Right. Joining discussion groups, maybe like the Coffee Party USA example they mentioned. Actively volunteering for a political campaign, making calls, knocking on doors, helping register voters, or joining an interest group focused on specific issues. Common Cause was mentioned, working on campaign finance reform and voting rights. There are groups for almost any issue imaginable.
Like environmental groups, budget watchdog groups, education advocates.
Exactly. And don't forget general community involvement. Volunteering at a local school, helping build houses with Habitat for Humanity, working at a food bank that's also a form of civic engagement. It strengthens the community fabric that supports everything else.
And then there's the more direct active engagement.
Yes, protest marches, demonstrations, sometimes even civil disobedience, consciously breaking a law seen as unjust, like activists did during the civil rights movement, or more recently with Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. Boycotts, refusing to buy from certain companies, or boycotts, deliberately supporting businesses aligned with your values, are also forms of direct action.
It's quite a range of options. The sources included that story about Richie Torres, who got involved young and ended up in Congress.
Yeah, quite an inspiring example of starting locally and making a big impact. It does make you wonder why more young people don't run for, say, local school board or city council, and what changes they could bring.
So who is engaging? Are there patterns?
There are. While many adults report doing something political in recent years, like maybe signing a petition online, fewer participate in more time-consuming ways, like attending meetings or volunteering for campaigns.
And age seems to be a factor.
It does. Historically, younger Americans, say 18 to 29, have tended to vote at lower rates and be less involved in traditional politics than older groups. However, it's not static. We saw youth turnout increase significantly in the 2018 midterms and hit record levels in the 2020 presidential election, especially in key states. So it can change.
Why the generally lower engagement among younger people, historically? What are some theories?
Several factors come up. One is increasing partisanship. Some younger people feel alienated by the intense negativity and focus on party loyalty over national interest. They might identify more as independent.
So the political fighting turns them off.
It can, yeah. Another factor is whether candidates are talking about issues that directly affect young people's lives. For a while, issues like college affordability weren't front and center. When figures like Bernie Sanders started focusing heavily on student debt and tuition costs, you saw a real surge in youth enthusiasm.
Issue relevance matters.
Definitely. Ideology plays a role too. Younger generations, on average, tend to lean more liberal than older generations, even young Republicans compared to older Republicans on certain issues. So the platforms of the major parties might not align perfectly with their views.
And practical things.
Yes, practical barriers exist. If you're a college student away from home, figuring out voter registration, absentee ballots, ID requirements, it can be complicated.
What about other factors like income and education?
There's a pretty clear correlation. People with higher incomes and more education are generally more likely to be regular voters and participate in other ways.
Why might that be?
Well, the sources talk about latent versus intense preferences. Latent preferences are ones you don't feel super strongly about, maybe formed on the spot. Intense preferences are deeply held beliefs you care a lot about over time.
And intense preferences drive action.
Exactly. They motivate people to donate, volunteer, go to rallies. And factors like wealth and education might give people more resources, more confidence, or perhaps more exposure to information that helps them develop those intense preferences and feel empowered to act on them.
Wow, okay. So wrapping this all up then, we've journeyed through what government actually is, this framework for how we organize ourselves and make collective decisions.
Right. And the different ways it functions, providing goods, structuring society, regulating the marketplace.
Then we look at that big question of who really governs, exploring the arguments for elite influence versus the idea of power being spread among competing groups, and landing on this idea that governing involves constant trade-offs.
Yeah, that balancing act seems key.
And finally, we dug into civic engagement, why it's so crucial, the many different ways you can participate from staying informed to direct action, and some of the factors that influence who participates and why.
And hopefully understanding all these pieces helps you, the listener, feel a bit more empowered to see how the system works, how decisions get made, and where you might be able to plug in effectively. It's not just abstract stuff, it connects to your life.
It really does. It makes you think, okay, which of these pathways feels right for me? Is there one small step I could take?
Exactly. And it leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on. Considering everything we've discussed, the influence of elites, the potential of pluralism, the necessity of trade-offs, the importance of engagement, what single action, if lots of average citizens started doing it, do you think would most significantly strengthen their collective voice in American government today?